The strange but true stories featured on this podcast contain details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Things Are About to Get Weird. Apologies for the slight delay in getting this episode to you. I lost my voice, which is not ideal for a podcaster, but it's back and I hope it sounds okay. Today, you join me for something a little bit different. Although you could argue that this episode has the same vibe as our recent installment about the strange stories behind everyday items. For a while now, I've been keeping a list on my phone, which I add to every time I learn a new fact or story which blows my mind for a specific reason, because it totally messes with my perception of time. These are the tales which don't feel quite right when you first hear them, because your brain tells you that there's no way that the two things involved could have possibly coexisted at the same time, for example. But then when you look deeper into them, you realize that they're absolutely true. I have just some of my favorite cases to share with you in this episode today, and a quick warning that there will be a couple of gory details coming up, but nothing I'll linger on for very long. But this is one of those topics that could have endless parts. I know lots of you absolutely loved our Strange Stories Behind Everyday Items episode, and don't worry, a part 2 will be coming for that. But the same applies for this one too. All of that said, let's get right on into it. If I were to ask you to picture a scene involving Jack the Ripper, what kind of image would your mind conjure up? The dark, smoky streets of Victorian London, with a menacing figure creeping around in the shadows, perhaps? A faceless man wearing clothing typical of the time, a long dark coat and a top hat, maybe even carrying something like a cane. Let's be honest, many of these details are based on fictionalized stories inspired by the infamous killer from over the decades, rather than rooted in fact. But my point is this: I'd bet that the world you're picturing is very, very different from the one we know today. So what would you say if I told you that in 1888, the year Jack the Ripper carried out his atrocious crimes, elsewhere, halfway around the world, there was a man preparing to register a company that is, to this day, one of the biggest, most recognizable, trailblazing entertainment brands on the planet. And that company is Nintendo. If you're thinking, what? Chai, what are you talking about? I hear you, that was my first reaction too, but as unlikely as it seems, there's a good chance that Jack the Ripper and the Nintendo brand existed at the same time. There are a couple of caveats though, so let me explain. Over in Kyoto, Japan in 1889, craftsman Fusajiro Yamauchi founded the Nintendo Company, who initially sold specialty handmade playing cards known as Hanafuda cards. And although most people today know Nintendo for their games consoles, the company very much still embrace their history and still cite 1889 as their year of origin. It's the same business. Now, whether you believe that Jack the Ripper was still walking around freely in 1889, or alternatively that he died the previous year when his murder spree is thought to have ended, will depend entirely on which Ripper theories you find most credible. But the fact remains that these two things, which feel like they belong to entirely different eras of history, were a reality within 12 months of one another, possibly concurrently. And this realization was so mind-boggling to me that it prompted my ongoing fascination with this world of facts that warp your whole concept of time. And as it turns out, The examples are endless. Here's another one that blew my mind when I first heard it. George Washington, the first president of the United States, never knew that dinosaurs existed. When you dig down into the details of this one, no pun intended, it's perhaps less shocking. But on the surface, it just seems like a wild statement to me. However, it's completely true. George Washington died on the 14th of December 1799, and it wasn't until the early 1840s that the term dinosauria started to be used in academic settings and papers. Prior to this, we'd also had the 1824 discovery of bones in Oxfordshire that the scholar William Buckland deemed to be from a giant lizard-like creature he called a megalosaurus. There had also been other discoveries of what we now know to be dinosaur bones in the centuries prior, such as in 1677 when Robert Plot thought he'd found the remains of extinct giant humans. But the concept of a dinosaur was not something that existed in George Washington's lifetime. The obviously weird thing about this one is that all of the dinosaur skeletons that have been discovered since this time were there in the ground all along for millions of years. Our knowledge of them is so recent in the grand scheme of things. But it still feels odd to think that some major historical figures were destined to never know what a T-Rex or a Triceratops or a Stegosaurus was. Of course, we could also pick any number of historically significant people who died prior to the early to mid 1800s to apply this one to, but for some reason it's often George Washington who is cited when this topic comes up. Speaking of renowned leaders, here's a fact about Cleopatra, which you may have heard before. It's one of those that's made the rounds on social media over the past few years, but still it never fails to make my head spin. Cleopatra, the ancient Egyptian queen, actually lived closer to the invention of the iPhone than she did the building of the pyramids of Giza. She was born in 69 or 70 BC and died in 30 BC. The building of the pyramids of Giza is thought to have been completed somewhere around 2504 BC, although every single source seems to state a slightly different date, whereas the first iPhone was released in 2007 AD. What this means is that Cleopatra lived hundreds of years closer to the age of selfies, WhatsApp messages, and Instagram filters than she did to the building of these ancient structures, which would have already been ancient to her mind too. That one gets me every time. Now, I never seem to be able to get too far into one of these kinds of episodes without mentioning a classic film. They always seem to crop up, and I have a pretty grisly fact for you, which has a peculiar link to one of the most famous and beloved movie franchises of all time, Star Wars. The very first Star Wars film was released in May of 1977 and has gone down in history as being an instant hit. Audiences were immediately obsessed with and engrossed by this sci-fi world George Lucas had created, and despite the film opening with on-screen text reading "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away," I'm sure that many of those who sat in the cinema that year felt like they were watching the film style of the future. But did you know that as the first Star Wars film was released, there was still a practice being carried out in France that I truly thought had been left behind centuries earlier? And that was the use of the guillotine as a method of capital punishment. This is absolutely wild to me. So, on the 10th of September 1977, months after the release of Star Wars, a 28-year-old man named named Hamida Jandoubi was executed by guillotine in Marseille after being found guilty of the murder of his former girlfriend, Elizabeth Bousquet. He was the last person to meet this antiquated fate before the death penalty was abolished in France in 1981, and actually the last person to ever be lawfully killed by way of beheading in the Western world. I also have a bonus fact that relates to this story too. The legendary actor Christopher Lee, who played Count Dooku in 2 of the later Star Wars films, was actually a witness to the very last public guillotine execution which took place in France. This happened several decades earlier in 1939 when German serial killer Eugen Weidmann was executed in Versailles. Christopher Lee was 17 years old at the time and on a visit to Paris when he found himself in the crowd watching the killer's death sentence be carried out. This is a fact that's often mentioned itself in conversations about events that don't quite seem to fit time-wise. But when you consider that Christopher Lee was 93 when he passed away in 2015 and how young he was when Weidmann was executed, you realize that the timings were possible even though it feels odd. At this point in the episode, I wanted to do a kind of quick fire segment where I tell you about some of the most surprising pairs of famous people who were at one point both alive at the same time, even if the overlap was small. The first one has been one of my favourite fun facts for years. It's one I've often amazed people by telling them. So would you be shocked to learn that the artist Picasso and the rapper Eminem fit this criteria? Pablo Picasso only passed away in 1973. He lived to the age of 91, which in itself is quite fascinating to me. I always used to associate him with an entirely different era, whereas Eminem was born in 1972. So for a few short months, on our planet existed an elderly Picasso and a baby Eminem. Whilst we're talking about world-renowned artists, I'd also love to mention one of my personal favourites, Salvador Dali. Would you believe me if I told you that Dali was once alive at the same time as the likes of Rihanna and Rupert Grint? This one sounds completely made up, but it's absolutely legitimate. Salvador Dali only passed away in 1989, which feels so recent it's bizarre, whereas Rihanna and Rupert Grint and also people like Adele were all born in 1988. So once again, we have this little crossover of time. Long-time listeners may remember that I've mentioned Dali on the podcast before in a Weird Fix episode, when I mentioned that he was the designer of the Chupa Chups logo. So with that extra info, this might seem less surprising, but I still think it sounds bonkers. Let's keep going though. I worked out that another weird pair in this list would be the legendary Charlie Chaplin and Ryan Reynolds. Ryan was born in Canada in 1976, whereas Charlie Chaplin didn't pass away until Christmas Day of 1977. This one really got me because they're two comic actors of entirely different eras that just feel worlds apart. But at one point, they were both here on Earth together. And finally, for this little section, two world leaders who, again, just seem like they had the peaks of their careers so far apart, but did actually live at the same time for a while. I'm talking about Winston Churchill and Barack Obama. Churchill passed away in 1965, whereas Obama was born in 1961. So of all of the pairs or groups I've noted, these two actually had the biggest overlap of all. I would actually love to know, if you could choose one of these pairs to invite to a dinner party, which would you pick? I am so intrigued to hear your answers. As a segue back into the main body of our episode, as I was doing my research, I kept seeing different references to certain songs being closer to a major event in history than they are to us today in 2026 as I'm recording this. So as I just mentioned Churchill, let's take the end of World War II as our marker point, so 1945. Here are a few songs that were released closer to the end of the Second World War than they were to today. Are you ready? Electric Avenue by Eddie Grant, an incredible song. Sweet Dreams (brackets are made of this) by the Eurythmics. Holiday by Madonna, Karma Chameleon by Culture Club, the Ghostbusters theme song by Ray Parker Jr. The list goes on and on. Most of these were either released or became widely known in either 1983 or 1984. And when you consider that the equidistant time between now and the end of World War II takes us towards the end of 1985, as I'm filming this of course, all of these songs land on the other side of this line of time. If you were to imagine someone dancing to and enjoying music just as the war ended, and then picture us now, I feel like us 2026 lot are still so closely linked to all of the songs I just mentioned. They're all still so much a part of our musical culture, but technically they're closer to this other era that feels so very different. This is why this topic is so enthralling to me. It just makes you think of things in entirely new lights. Speaking of songs, I couldn't resist throwing this one in here for my fellow former pop punk kids. I mean, I say former, I'm still very much a pop punk fan. I'm just a 35-year-old one now. You know the song 1985 by Bowling for Soup, written by SR71? That was released in 2004, right? I'm sure many of us remember it well. I know that when I first listened to it, I felt like it was talking about a time that was so long ago, before I was even born. It seemed like an entire universe away. Well, if the same song were to be written today, about a year the same relative time ago, it would be called 2007. Now, I don't know about you, but in my mind, 2007 was 5 years ago maximum. I still have a couple of items of clothing and the odd pair of shoes from 2007. I remember events from that year so vividly. It's absolutely bonkers to me that people listening to that song in 2004, who were the same age that I am now, would have felt this way about 1985. It's so strange. There have actually been some updated versions of the song that have gained traction on social media over the past few years, so I'm definitely not the only person to have possibly overthought this one, but it only adds to the weird feeling for me. We're going to head further back in time now though, and for any of you who are as interested in the history of witch trials as I am, I think you'll find this part especially fascinating. Arguably one of the most famous witch trials of all took place in Salem in the US state of Massachusetts between the start of 1692 and the middle of 1693. During this dark time, around 200 people were accused of partaking in witchcraft. Although, as we know, there was virtually no basis whatsoever for these claims, and 25 people ended up having their lives taken away, either via execution or due to atrocious prison conditions that they experienced whilst they awaited trial. Like the vast majority of witch trials throughout the centuries, the Salem example was a clear product of paranoia and superstition getting way out of hand, fueled by warped religious ideologies and misguided fears. I could talk about this all day long. And if you're intrigued by the topic of witch trials, we do have an entire episode about the Pendle witch trials, which took place here in the UK. It's episode 43 if you fancy checking it out. But my point is that the utter frenzy of these events conjure up images of chaotic medieval sham courts and puritanical judges condemning people to death with no proof of any wrongdoing whatsoever, even though the Salem trials were post-medieval, of course, but you get my drift. So how wild is it to think about the fact that 5 years prior to the Salem witch trials taking place, a huge stride had been made in the world of science that changed the face of physics forever, when Sir Isaac Newton published details of his 3 laws of motion findings in his 1687 book Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. These 2 occurrences happening anywhere near each other feels totally out of balance and hard to get your head around. But when you think that Newton published this work before the Salem witch trials, it's even more bizarre. The juxtaposition of the scientific and the fatally superstitious is so jarring that it completely messes with my idea of the timeline of humanity in a way. Obviously, I'm no scientist myself, but I think most people today are aware of just how influential Newton's work really was. He discovered the laws of gravity and co-invented calculus, and essentially helped to shape our understanding of the universe, all whilst things like witch trials were still taking place. It is just astonishing to me. I think it's time for an animal-based palate cleanser fact. And if you're a fan of literature and its link with the animal world, then this one is for you. The epic novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville was first published in 1851 and is a tale told from the perspective of a sailor named Ishmael, who describes his captain Ahab's bizarre mission to seek revenge on a giant whale, a whale that previously caused him to lose a leg. I have attempted to read Moby Dick several times, but it's an absolute mission and I've never quite finished it. However, there's no doubt it's a true classic. One of those books that seems like it's been around forever, for generations and generations. It's a proper part of literary history. So what if I were to tell you that there's a high possibility that somewhere out there in the ocean, there are still a number of whales alive today that were around when Herman Melville published Moby Dick? I know, I thought this couldn't possibly be true, but when I did a little more reading, I realised the theory absolutely holds up. So, although not all whales can live this long, there are certain species of this magnificent mammal that it's believed could make it to over 200 years old, namely the bowhead whale. Now, Moby Dick wasn't based on a bowhead. It's thought that Melville took inspiration for him from a real sperm whale, but nevertheless, they're all part of the same family, right? So it could very well be that a bowhead whale who was relatively young back in 1851 as the book came out could be just over 175 years old and still swimming around in the ocean today. Bowheads are really quite interesting actually. They live in the Arctic all year round and have these huge heads, plus the largest mouth of any mammal we know of. They also have not 1, but 2 blowholes. Fun bonus fact there for you, but sadly it's believed that there are only around 10,000 of them left in the wild. So they're a very special bunch and very much in need of protection and respect. I mean, that should come as standard, but you know. Whilst we're on the topic of animals, I couldn't resist throwing this next fact in here too. I love a good tortoise. I just think they are amazing creatures. And arguably one of the most famous to have ever lived was the giant tortoise named Harriet. Now it's believed that Harriet originated from one of the Galapagos Islands, Santa Cruz, and it's estimated that she first hatched in around 1830. She lived until the ripe old age of either 175 or 176 years old, only passing away in June of 2006 in the place which later became her home, in Queensland, Australia. Harriet actually died just a few months before one of her owners, and my fellow millennials and older, I'm sure you might be able to guess the name of the owner I'm referring to. It was, of course, the utter legend that was Steve Irwin. Harriet had been brought to the Australia Zoo in Queensland by the Irwins a couple of decades earlier, having spent the majority of her life in various other parts of the country, and became a true part of the fabric of both the zoo and the Irwin family. Harriet's association with one of the most influential animal experts of all time in Steve Irwin is well documented, but if reports are to be believed, it's possible that the crocodile hunter wasn't the first renowned naturalist to be linked with her, because all the way back when she was but a young tortoise, in around 1835, it's thought that she spent some time with none other than Charles Darwin. Now, many reports about this story tend to get a little overexcited and take things to the extreme, claiming things like, did you know that Charles Darwin and Steve Irwin once owned the same pet tortoise? And as far as I can tell, that's not quite the full truth. Whilst Harriet definitely did live with the Irwins in her later life, the claim that she was once owned by Darwin is a bit far-fetched. While some believe that Darwin was part of the group who initially collected Harriet from the Galapagos and took her to England for a little while, before she was ultimately transported to Australia, others state that it's more likely that their relationship was more fleeting, though most agree that there's a strong possibility they really did cross paths at one point. This is interesting enough for me. The idea that Darwin and Steve Irwin interacted with the very same animal is wild. I can't believe I hadn't come across this tale before researching this episode. It's the perfect example of something which makes my perception of time feel totally fuzzy. To have something as tangible as a living creature which links together these two people from what feels like different ages is nothing short of incredible. I actually have another quick fire section for you now, because whilst I was putting this episode together, I came across a bit of a running theme within the topic of things that feel out of place for the time. I think most of us know that photography isn't necessarily an ultra-modern invention. The theory which makes photography possible was discovered a very long time ago, and most people accept that the first successful photographs were developed during the late 1820s. But there are a few notable people who you may be surprised to learn were actually captured via photo during their lifetime, because it just feels as though they lived during a decidedly pre-photograph era. People like the first Duke of Wellington. Yes, the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. Stick with me on this one. The Duke was born in 1769 and lived to the age of 83. When he was 75 years old in 1844, his image was captured by Queen Victoria's court photographer Antoine Claudette, a process which it's thought would have taken around 20 minutes to complete due to the long exposure time required. Much better than the time it would have taken to sit for a painted portrait, but incredibly lengthy compared to our 21st century standards. Another example is the photograph of the 6th US President, John Quincy Adams. Adams was born even earlier in 1767 and sat for what's considered the earliest known photo of a US president in 1843, taken by the artist Philip Haas in Washington, D.C. Kim Saget from the US National Portrait Gallery said in a comment about the photo, quote, "John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, was the last president to have a direct tie back to the founding generation, and the fact that he sat in front of a camera to have his portrait taken is sort of remarkable." And I definitely agree. One last one to mention, and this is a bit different, but when you think of the legendary composer Mozart, who both lived and died in the 1700s, tragically passing away at the age of just 35, you might think that there's no way a photograph connected to him could exist. And you'd be right when it comes to him himself, but it is believed that a photo of his widow, Constance Mozart, survives. There was a group portrait taken in 1840 which is thought to include Constance, who would have been around 78 years old at the time, taken at the home of her friend, composer Max Keller in Bavaria. I thought this modern feeling link with a figure who seems to have lived an unfathomably long time ago was fascinating. And finally for today, I wanted to end on one of those strange little facts I've always found oddly charming, and it's largely because it concerns one of my favourite celebrities of all time, the one and only Betty White. I adored Betty White. I even named my old car after her because it was white and kind of a bubble shape, and it reminded me of her iconic hairstyle. You could say that I think Betty White was the best thing since sliced bread, only that would be an entirely inaccurate statement, because in fact, sliced bread was technically the best thing since Betty White. Why? Because whilst Betty was born in January of 1922, pre-sliced bread only became something commonly commercially available in 1928. The bread slicing machine, which also immediately wrapped the bread to prevent it going stale, was invented by a man named Otto Frederick Rohwedder, and it completely revolutionized the way that bread was sold to and consumed by the public, eventually all over the world. I was just about to round off by saying that after learning this fact, I'll never again be able to think about sliced bread without associating it with the wonderful Betty White. But the truth is that all of the facts in this episode have changed my perceptions in one way or another. Yes, they've all had that whoa factor in terms of the perception of time, but many of them have also made me realize that perhaps things are all a little more connected than we think on first inspection. Things can often feel very disjointed or out of sync, and as much as some of these facts have messed with my mind, perhaps what has surprised me most of all through this process is that this sense of connection has also left me feeling weirdly comforted too. Oh, I would love to know which camp you find yourself in at the end of this episode. Have you found the mini stories in this episode the good kind of weird or the unsettling kind of weird? Which of the facts shocked you the most? And were there any you had already heard about or realised yourself previously? Do you have a favourite "this will warp your view of time" fact that you'd like to share? I am so excited excited to read all of your comments, so please feel free to leave me a note wherever you're listening today or over on our social media pages. I know they're going to be so much fun to read. I also hope that all of my maths has been correct in this episode. If it hasn't, I'm sure someone will let me know. But for now, we still have one more segment to go today. So come with me as we head on over to our trusty outro feature, Weird Media. I have an absolute treat for you in Weird Media today, providing that you're partial to a bit of horror in the form of a TV show, which I absolutely am. So a few weeks ago, on a random Tuesday night, I found myself watching the start of a program I'd never even heard of before, called From. And only a few minutes in, I said out loud, this has got to be something to do with Stephen King. It's just perfectly his style. But I was actually completely wrong. It was created by John Griffin. And while Stephen King is apparently a big fan of the show, he's not actually involved with it. My point is, if you're a King fan like me, I think you will love From. Here is an incredibly brief rundown of the plot. The show centres around this town, which looks small and a bit run down, with a few houses, a diner, a small church. But whilst it doesn't look anything special, we soon learn that this town is both extraordinary and horrifying, because once a person enters it, they can no longer leave. That concept is chilling enough. But when you add in the fact that once darkness falls every evening, the town is patrolled by these demonic, human-like creatures whose aim is to manipulate the residents into letting them indoors and then promptly devouring them, it naturally all becomes even more sinister. I love absolutely everything about From. The concept is fantastic, the performances are brilliant, Harold Perrineau is the main character. He plays the town sheriff and he really is exceptional. The sets are great, the storylines are captivating, the twists and turns are shocking. It's honestly one of those shows I cannot believe I didn't know about for so long. There are currently 4 series of From available to watch, and the 5th and sadly final season was announced earlier this year. So you've got plenty to catch up on and something amazing to look forward to as well. I'm sure it's available to watch in a few places, but I've watched it on Now TV, and it has honestly become one of my very favourite TV programmes. It's one I know I'm going to re-watch for years to come. So if you're after something that's both genuinely scary and utterly compelling, look no further than From. Thank you so much once again for joining me for this week's episode of the podcast. I hope you found this one as interesting to listen to as I did to put together. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including links and shout outs to all of the many sources I used during my research. And I'll also be listing our social media pages along with our email address. If you're listening on Spotify, please feel free to leave us a comment to share your views on today's facts. And you can also get in touch on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or Threads. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would massively appreciate a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's a wonderful free way to support the show. Finally, if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you so much again for being here today, and now that my voice has returned, I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others, and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.